Okay, now our last line, the last line we're going to look at is the deep front line. I'm not saying that these are all the lines there are in the body. You may even be able to discover your own once you have the idea of the Anatomy Train's myofascial meridians, but this is the last one that I'm going to put out on this tape anyway. And this line is very important and is more fascial than muscular. So we've been looking at a lot of the myofascial chains, and this has a few muscles that go along it, but you have to follow the fascial planes, the intermuscular septa, to really see this one. So watch closely. Here we go. We're going to start on the bottom of the foot with the attachments of a muscle called the tibialis posterior. We would also include, I really want to stay with this deep muscle, which comes right down here and has a tendon like a hand with about 5 or 6 different fingers that hold on to most of the bones that are under the tarsum of the foot. So it kind of supports that medial arch as it does so. We could also include the flexor hallucis longus and digitorum longus, and they go on up around behind this medial malleolus on your ankle, up in behind here, and deeper than your Achilles tendon, going into the back of the leg here. So again, if we looked at tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, and flexor hallucis longus, we got another Tom, Dick, and Harry coming back here into what's known as the deep posterior compartment of the leg, which you can see on the slide here. Now, this deep posterior compartment goes onto the back side of the fibula and the tibia and ties into this interosseous membrane way deep in the leg. So here we are going up the posterior side of the leg, and we get onto the fascia of the capsule of the knee. And this is also, again, we're following more fascia than muscle. You could think about the popliteus in this level of fascia. However, it's just really the capsule of the knee and the fascia that's going along with the neurovascular bundle, the bundle that's carrying the nerves and the blood vessels. And it crosses the knee with the neurovascular bundle, with the bundle of nerves and blood vessels, and cuts through back to the front of the leg, from the back to the front of the leg, through a hole in the adductor magnus muscle known as the adductor hiatus. So you may think it's strange that the deep front line actually starts out on the bottom of the foot, which is where the back line started, and goes to definitely the back of the leg. However, biologically, this was the front of your leg. Your leg, when you were a salamander, when your granddad's granddad was a salamander, your leg faced this way. This was the front of your leg. In the course of embryological and evolutionary development, both, the leg turns in so that what was the front side of your leg has become the inside or the back side of your leg. So here we are back on the front of the leg. Now, the next journey that this deep front line takes is up the intermuscular septum that runs between the quadriceps muscle and the adductor muscles. This is the line that you can see in this Vesalius slide, and it takes us right up the side of the linea aspera, the front side of the linea aspera, on this plane up to the femoral triangle, which is right in, let's just stick this to the side. Femoral triangle is right in here, and call it the groin. You also can call it the leg pit, because it is to the leg what the armpit is to the arm. Here you've got the blood vessels and the nerve, the femoral vein, artery, and nerve going through here. And you have our favorite muscle of all the body, the psoas, going through here. So you can travel up here on the psoas into the groove created by the transverse processes and the bodies of the vertebrae, of the lumbar vertebrae. I'm drawing this as if it's a line, but it's actually a series of muscles, 1 to the 5th, 1 to the 4th, 1 to the 3rd, 1 to the 2nd, 1 to the 1st, 1 to the 12th thoracic vertebra. So here we have a line going up through the body that starts from the bottom of the foot, goes up the back of the lower leg, around to the inside of the thigh, up to the front of the hip, and across behind the guts This muscle is retroperitoneal. It's behind all your intestines and attaching to the side of the lumbar vertebrae here. This area of the groin here and the hip is just so important. Again, it's such a common postural fault to see the hip closed or the lower back pulled forward, and by cause of the muscles that go through here. And when I first started working, nobody had heard of the psoas and nobody knew what it was, and now when I go to teach people, everybody thinks must be the psoas. So I want to get a little more clarity in this area here. So here's the psoas express. This is the express muscle going through here. Now, if you looked at just below the psoas attachment, almost in the same place, is a muscle called the pectineus. And the pectineus comes up here to the iliopectineal ridge on the pubic bone. And if you wanted to keep going in this same direction, you could get on the psoas minor, for those people who have a psoas minor, which would carry you back up, carry you back up on top of the psoas to T12L1. So you could cover this same distance with the pectineus and the psoas minor that you covered with the psoas. Let's cut this off because there's another. Put this over here. There's another local here that runs outside the psoas. You can see that this pectineus, if I could get it to stick, is running inside the psoas. Here comes another one outside the psoas. The iliacus or iliacus comes along here, starts with the same tendon as the psoas, but opens up into the hip here and fills in this whole inside of the iliac fossa, but its top attachment here is along the inside of the iliac crest. If you keep right on going from the inside of the iliac crest, you get right on to the quadratus lumborum muscle, which also takes you up to the 12th rib and the first lumbar vertebrae. So, if you had to get from the inside of the leg to this area of the 12th thoracic vertebrae, first lumbar, you could take three routes. You could take the psoas express up the inside here, you could take the pectineus and then psoas minor local, or you could take the iliacus quadratus lumborum local. All of these need to be considered when you're thinking about fully opening up the hip so that people get full hip extension. I guess it's obvious, but there will be an equal and opposite deep front line. I hope it's equal. Oftentimes it's not equal. In all the cases of scoliosis, pelvic imbalance, these two lines are not going to be exactly equal, but in terms of anatomy, there's an equal and opposite line coming up over here and coming up on the psoas on this side. Now, if you, once you get to here, the bifurcation stops, and as far as the line goes, we're going into a lot of structures that are singular. It's not that there's an equal and opposite left and right side, but there is one structure. For instance, the next one we're going to is the diaphragm. There's only one diaphragm. But this oneness in terms of the deep front line carries on down here in terms of the anterior longitudinal ligament, which you can see in this slide goes right down all the way to the tailbone. So if we were to look at this as an anatomy train, we could start right here, and we're just going to consider the anterior longitudinal ligament here. We go down around, I got to get around this metal stuff here, and down onto the tailbone, across the pelvic floor, which you can see in the slide there. See how that pelvic floor, especially the pubococcygeus muscle, is just an extension of the anterior longitudinal ligament coming across the floor of the pelvis. But hey, we don't have to stop there. We can get right on the rectus abdominis and carry ourselves right up the front of the spine. So, right up the front of the body. So you could say, I know that we've already put the rectus abdominis in as part of the superficial front line, but now I would like to give you the idea that the anterior longitudinal ligament and the pelvic floor and the rectus abdominis are kind of a long tail to the spine. At least, maybe a tail is going too far, but they are definitely part of a line here that surrounds the abdominal balloon and gives shape to the abdominal balloon. And sometime when we talk about this a little more, we can put in the clinical implications of this. But I wanted you to see that if we had taken the deep front line down from the top instead of up from the bottom, we'd get down to this place. We could either go straight down the spine and onto the pelvic floor, or we jump onto the psoas, which would take us left or right. So now we're going to continue going on up from here. And if you look at the slide there, you can see that there's a clear interdigitation here between the fibers of the psoas coming up like this and the fibers of the diaphragm coming down like that. If you look at the interface between the crura of the diaphragm and the psoas in your anatomy books, it looks as though they're completely separate. But I'll tell you, if you do any dissection, you will see that the fascia is absolutely continuous from the psoas to the crura of the diaphragm. It is really hard to tell where one stops and the other begins. The diaphragm arises out of these fibers of the psoas and out of the anterior longitudinal ligament and comes across in a dome here, which you probably can't see, but you know where the diaphragm is anyway, don't you? The central tendon of the diaphragm comes across here and attaches to the xiphoid process on the back. So that is one route that we can take with the deep front line. This whole route here, the inside of the chest is part of the whole route of the deep front line, but we're going to take a few different roads through here. So one would be to take the diaphragm forward to the back side of the sternum, and then we can travel up. Can you see my hand inside the sternum here? Travel up the transversus thoracis, come up behind the sternum, and let's see, we'll make our little guys do that here. Come up behind the sternum, and where are we? We're behind the sternum on those little guys that go right on up. Here, we'll take Gustav's head off just for a moment, he doesn't mind. That go right on up to the hyoid bone. In fact, they go inside the hyoid bone and out like this to the floor of the mouth. So the most forward route, if we took the most anterior route up the deep front line, we would be going from the diaphragm over the central tendon of the diaphragm to the xiphoid process here, up the back side of the sternum, the inside of the sternum with the transversus thoracis and all that fascia, and come out the top at the behind the sternum and up these little muscles here to the hyoid bone and forward to the chin. That's one route up here. And obviously we could continue with the jaw muscles which hold the jaw to the face. We won't go through all those in detail, but just to understand that the visceral part of your throat is connected down through your chest into the deep front line on the front side of your spine. Okay? All right, that was the front route for the deep front line. Now we got a middle route of the deep front line. We go up and forward on the diaphragm again, but this time we stop in the middle of the central tendon. What's attached to the middle of the central tendon? Look at the slide, you will see that the pericardium is attached to the middle of the central tendon. The pericardium is the bag around the heart, and that's part of a big connective tissue structure which runs front to back here in the chest, like that, and contains the pericardium and the visceral pleura of the parietal pleura of the lungs and all the tubing that's in here. And if you come right up with that, you come up to the top of the lungs and the top of the heart with all this fascia of the thoracic inlet up here. And inlet or outlet? I always forget. Anyway, coming up here to the top of the dome of the lungs, you get onto the scalenes, and the scalenes carry you right across to the anterior tubercles. These muscles are major, major suspensory muscles. The scalenus anterior, middle, and posterior are major. Of course, they go to the ribs, but the inner fascia actually goes to the lung itself, actually holds up this mediastinal tissue. So you could say that the organs are suspended between the psoas and the quadratus lumborum on the bottom and the scalenes at the top. This fascia is really important in holding up the organs. So our middle route with the deep front line in the chest goes up the diaphragm, through the pericardium of the heart, out with the connective tissue of the mediastinum, and up on the scalenes and the scalene fascia onto the cervical vertebrae. As I mentioned before, there are also little muscles back here that connect those vertebrae to the back of the skull, so that would be the end of the line going in that direction. Okay, and just one more, the back root of the deep front line is just the continuation of the anterior longitudinal ligament right up the spine, and it would go right up to the top of the neck and would attach to the skull. So if we put the skull back down on there, you can see this baby coming right up, I'll just have to show you on here, and attaching to the front of the skull, right in front of the skull. So if we, I don't know if this is going to work, if we put Gustav back on there, you could see Gustav's head back on there, you could see this line coming right up the front of the neck and going right into the bottom of the skull, where you can see it there on the anatomy slide. So that's the third most deep, the third posterior part of the deep front line. This is a very complicated line. It's a line that has a lot to do with our psychophysiology, because it's right where the organs attach to the back. The backbone is the biggest part of our doingness, part of our moving around, the part of us that we think of is in control. The gut part is much more ancient and asserts its control when it needs to. And it is attached all the way along the front of the spine here through the mesentery and the mediastinum all the way up. So this deep front line, especially in the trunk here, is right on that interface. And to me, this is another way of speaking of this is as a core line. And if you really want to get balance in the body, and if you really want to get the deepest kind of health and the deepest kind of full expression for the person, getting length along this line all the way from the inner arch, all the way from the inner archway down here, up the back of the leg, up the inside of the adductors, and up the front of the spine, getting that front of the spine to lengthen, that's what really produces health and full expression in a person. The deep front line starts deep in the plantar surface of the foot, runs up behind the calf in the deep posterior compartment, swirls around to the front on the intermuscular septum, picks up the psoas, goes to the front of the spine, and follows the anterior longitudinal ligament all the way up to the skull. In that interface between the organic body and the musculoskeletal body, this is the deep front line. More complex poses like this stretch lines in combination. You can see that the lateral line for most of the body is being stretched by this pose on this side. However, the spiral line is being stretched from this side of the neck around to the opposite hip. And in the forward leg, you have a stretch in the deep front line from the groin down to the foot. Obviously, it would be the same on the other side for the other sides of the lines. Come on up.